So, an Italian city with a history stretching back to antiquity, soaring orchestral music, and a singer named Tosca. Perhaps surprisingly, I'm not talking about Puccini. I'm not even talking about an opera. In fact, my paper today concerns an early silent film, Gli ultimi giorni di Pompei, a cinematic landmark from the anni d'oro of Italian silent cinema, or the golden years of the 1910s. Gli ultimi giorni is an adaptation of The Last Days of Pompeii, a well-known novel of 1834 by the English writer Edward Bulwer-Lytton, made in Turin by the major film producer Ambrosio and premiered in Rome in August 1913. The film is today noteworthy for its full-length, continuous, specially composed film score. Indeed, it is one of very few such scored films of the era to have survived the significant degradation of both filmic and musical archives. The score, then, is an exceptional artifact, not least because most films from this period were musicalized by less elaborate means. But precisely because of its exceptional status, the score to Gli ultimi giorni offers an invaluable window onto film's entwinement with music in its early years, and on the conflicting aspirations of the filmmakers, composers, and critics who grappled with the musical potential of the new medium. In particular, Gli ultimi giorni can help us revise a common supposition about early cinema and the music that accompanied it, namely that silent film's musical aesthetics are rooted in the music theatrical genres that preceded it, including pantomime, melodrama, and especially opera. What I want to suggest in this paper, however, is that focusing exclusively on cinema's operatic genealogies has an unintended consequence, that of obscuring the processes by which film music assumed a distinct identity of its own. In other words, by directing our attention primarily towards cinema's unquestionably extensive inheritance from the cultural forms that preceded it, we risk missing those ways in which the novel medium of film brought about a new, distinctly filmic form of music. So I'll begin by showing you a brief clip. In this scene that you're about to see, the blind slave girl Nidia declares her love for the protagonist, Glauco, while he embraces his lover, Ione, in the background. This dramatic situation is accompanied by music that will sound to you unquestionably like Italian opera. There's the soaring melody, evocative of Verismo style and orchestration. There's also the 5-flat key signature, typical of impassioned, late romantic, operatic emotionality. And you can follow the relevant passage from the score in example 1 on your handout. Of course, the most strikingly operatic feature of the music is the one I purposely neglected to mention, the presence of a singing voice. And it's worth dwelling on this operatic intrusion into the cinematic context. A character in a silent film, or mute film to use Italian terminology, is being given a voice, quite literally. Nidia is unmuted by the soprano that accompanies her mimed distress. Adapting Caroline Abate's work, I'll be calling this effect invoicing. Crucially, invoicing in this film is only associated with the character of Nidia. And in fact, Nidia is invoiced on 2 other occasions as well. Once in the middle of the film, with an aria that recalls Verdi rather than Puccini, and again at the end, where the music you just heard returns to serve as a transcendent denouement. Superficially, this early cinematic aria seems a cast-iron example of remediation, to use the term coined by media theorists J. David Bolter and Richard Gruson. That is, new media implicitly or explicitly represent older media, and it is through the recognition of those older media that new media are understood. Or, to use Bolter and Gruson's own words, any new medium appropriates the techniques, forms, and social significance of the and of other media, and attempts to rival or refashion them. Cinema, the new medium in this case, made explicit its resemblance to opera, an older medium. According to this argument, the ersatz Puccini in the score to Gli Ultimi Giorni is what made the unfolding cinematic drama intelligible to an audience competent in the operatic style. Attempts to channel opera's prestige at this time were quite deliberate. During the 1910s, Italian filmmakers were desperately seeking to elevate the critical profile of cinema among cultured individuals who continued to hold the medium in low esteem despite its prodigious technical and artistic evolution in the preceding years. In the creative ferment of the Anni d'Oro, one strategy pursued by the biggest film producers, such as Ambrosio in Turin and Cinis in Rome, was to hire composers to endow their highest prestige productions with full-length scores in the manner of opera. For Gli Ultimi Giorni, Ambrosio engaged the Italo-Belgian composer Carlo Graziani Walter to provide the music. Like most Italian composers of his generation, Graziani Walter had tried his hand at opera early in his career, though by 1913 he was best known for his pedagogical compositions for piano and for mandolin. Indeed, except for Nidia's music, much of the score for Gli Ultimi Giorni is indebted stylistically to Graziani Walter's competence in popular genres, not opera. The score is constructed in a series of short, melodically driven modules, steadfastly diatonic for the most part, which generally correspond to a segment of film between two intertitles. So it's not just the singing voice that makes Nidia's arias stand out. Rather, the overt gestures towards a more prestigious operatic style are conspicuous precisely because of that style's absence elsewhere. In practical terms, the decision to invoice an on-screen character was, in 1913, rather bold. The singer would have stood behind or beside the screen, and while this was a common arrangement for producing simpler sound effects in early cinema, gunshots, hoofbeats, and so on, long passages of singing would have been fraught with the possibility of embarrassing errors of timing. Nevertheless, this risk seems to have paid off, at least going by one contemporary review which appeared in the Florentine broadsheet La Nazione, following the film's presentation at Florence's Teatro Verdi. Critics of early cinema habitually remained silent on musical matters, so this reviewer's discussion of Graziani Walter's music is especially gratifying. Maestro Graziani Walter has worked on an effect that came off splendidly, that of blending together the action of the cinematic drama, descriptive instrumental music, and the human voice. The notes that Signora Tosca Ferroni sang simultaneously with the actions of the character of the young blind girl in the film made a profound impression on the audience. It really seemed as though the character was singing. This is certainly an effect to be studied, and which has the potential to add considerably to the allure of cinematic reproductions. The reviewer, like us, was struck by the invoicing effect, but it's worth noting what he does and what he does not say. In common with many early observers of cinema, he expresses a wonderment that seems, from our perspective, incommensurate with the film's actual qualities. Apparently, it seemed that the character were singing, although you may have noticed while watching that her lips don't actually move. More importantly, he does not leap from really singing to the seemingly logical next step, opera. Instead, Nidia's invoicing is described in circuitous terms as a blend of cinematic action, instrumental music, and the human voice, which is to say, with voice and music kept apart in a distinctly unoperatic fashion. Indeed, the reviewer seems to have intuited, however subliminally, that despite their operatic trappings, Nidia's arias were fundamentally cinematic artifacts. To elaborate on this idea, I'd like to play you another clip from Gli Ultimi Giorni. This scene reinscribes the love triangle dynamics from the first clip you saw. Here, the audience, through Nidia, although you won't actually see that part, spy on an amorous rendezvous between the two romantic leads. Together with other elements, like the garden setting, this scene recalls that most operatic of numbers, the love duet, making it an obvious candidate for musical accompaniment in elevated style. And yet, in register, in tone, in genre, the music here seems quite the opposite of opera. In fact, it clearly indexes popular music of the period, audible in the octave heavy texture, the stride bass, the tonic dominant alternation, and the modular construction. And you can follow the score again with example 2 on your handout. This music was published by Ambrosio in 2 different formats. Most obviously, it can be found in the piano reduction of the full score. Reductions of elaborate film scores were not uncommon. They could be used by musicians accompanying projections of the film in theatres lacking orchestral capabilities, and they granted legitimacy to the music through their resemblance to, say, operatic vocal scores. But in an unprecedented move, the music from this scene was also published separately in sheet music form, under an evocative title borrowed from the intertitle that introduces the scene, Amore, Amore. Only 2 extracts from the score were given this treatment, the other being the Sfilata dei Gladiatori, from a scene set in a gladiatorial arena, which is in the style of a march suite for brass band. Both extracts thus reference popular music, and were marketed as such, targeting, it seems, the large market for sheet music in genres like the waltz, the foxtrot, the march, and the like. None of the other surviving scores of the Anni d'Oro were split up in this way, which begs the question, why, given the ongoing efforts to ennoble cinema at this time, did Ambrosio select the most popular-sounding music from the score for separate publication? A comparison with opera is instructive here, for operas were also published in multiple formats at this time, including complete vocal scores and sheet music of admired extracts. Theoretically, Italian opera contemporary with Gli Ultimi Giorni privileged a continuous musical thread, inspired by Wagnerian notions of endless melody, that resisted this excerpting process. But commercial exigencies meant that excerption happened frequently. Consider the aria Vici d'arte from Puccini's Tosca. Puccini famously debated cutting the aria before the premiere, concerned about its static, pezzo staccato nature, evidence precisely of its extractability from an otherwise tightly knit score. His publisher Ricordi, however, had no qualms about printing and reprinting the aria in sheet music form in the years afterwards, in several different languages to boot. Had Gli Ultimi Giorni been an opera, we might imagine that Nidia's arias would have been published separately. Excised from a cinematic setting, however, the arias are revealed as a poor substitute for the Puccinian style they imitate. The words, for instance, are unpoetic, lacking meter and rhyme. The music is rhythmically repetitious and harmonically unremarkable. Generic though they are, the words also yoke Nidia's arias to the film in a way that precludes effective performance outside the cinema. And because the arias are through composed, lacking the flexible modularity found elsewhere in the score, it's hard to imagine them being repurposed to accompany other films. The same cannot be said for Amore Amore. Indeed, it succeeds as an extract because it essentially lacks any intrinsic connection to the segment of film it accompanies, despite being embedded in a continuous score. But this is profoundly ironic, for with little to distinguish the extract musically from other light music being written at the time, the filmic connection would have been its unique selling point. Ambrosio's answer to this conundrum was to splash across the cover of the sheet music a posed still from the relevant scene. Without this visual support and the curious verbal identification gavotte from the film Gli Ultimi Giorni di Pompei, one senses that potential consumers would be hard-pressed to identify Amore Amore as a cinematic artifact. In other words, the arias for Nidia fall somewhere in between the operatic aesthetics of Vici d'arte and the popular aesthetics of Amore Amore, too generic to function as standalone operatic arias, but too individualized to function independently as popular music. Fundamentally, the effect of these arias depends on their realization in situ. For audiences at this historical moment, for whom continuous musical accompaniment to a film was still novel, and for whom a moving image of a woman combined with a woman's voice was utterly new, for them the arias could have the profound effect recorded by the critic for La Nazione. But it needed the support of a professional singer, of the moving images of an impressionable crowd. This tension illuminates some key differences between opera and cinema at this time. To see these two media as related is to privilege certain basic homologies in presentation. Both have a visual and a musical component, whose combination results in a unified audiovisual experience. This comparison, however, is limited. In an operatic performance, the singers on stage have agency, in that they are constitutive of the musical work. Their singing is part of the music, regardless of the visual spectacle to which they contribute. But a silent film projection preserves only a record of the actor's past agency, and consequently, actors have no role in the creation of the music that accompanies them. Communication occurs, but only in one direction. Music follows the image, but the images cannot respond to the music. The varying fortunes of the extract from Pompeii illustrate the practical consequences of this difference. Since music was always added retrospectively, it took an extraordinary amount of effort to write music that truly aligned with film in a meaningful way. Graziani Walter offered two solutions to this problem. The first, illustrated by Amore Amore, was essentially not to try. Beyond the need to begin and end roughly in time with the scene, this light, popular style of music made few demands for explicit synchronization with the film. The other, illustrated by Nidia's arias, was to try to make the music feature, to make its presence feel impelled by the images on screen. But Graziani Walter could not ultimately make those same images need the music. These two responses represent a crossroads in the evolution of cinema. During the 1910s, critics not only sought to understand film within the framework of earlier multimedia genres, they wanted to make of it a new audiovisual art form on a par with those genres. As the critic for La Nazione declared, this is an effect that should be studied. The invoicing of Nidia represented one option for the further evolution of film as a musical genre, one prized by a critical establishment keen to see film flower into opera's mechanically mediated cousin. But this was essentially a utopian vision, sustainable only during the good years before the First World War, when the commercial mass media potential of early film was yet to be fully realized. Indeed, the overall trajectory of film music in the years following Gli Ultimi Giorni would see it turn away from projects of elevation. In the 1920s, with the Italian film industry decimated by the post-war economic crisis, no one had much of an appetite, or the cash, to provide films with expensive full-length scores. Instead, the mostly foreign-made films distributed in Italy were fitted with popular songs and instrumental numbers, known as motivi, which served as main themes for the films in question. Like Amore Amore, these songs were published as sheet music, and their identification as film music relied on various visual and verbal markers. The examples on the slide reproduce photographs and signatures of the actors, pertinent filmic imagery, and descriptive tags, like love theme from the film Settimo Cielo. In other words, in Gli Ultimi Giorni di Pompeii, we can see, however embryonically, the beginnings of a way of musicalizing film entirely particular to the medium. The traits of this distinctly filmic form, let's call it film music, that would prove most durable in the decades to come are precisely those discernible in Amore Amore. What then of opera as an ancestor of cinema? I'm not saying that opera is irrelevant to the development of early film music. Quite the reverse. It seems inconceivable that this score to Gli Ultimi Giorni could have been written without opera as a guiding principle. But we ought not to neglect looking forwards. Otherwise, we risk imputing a casual linearity to the relationship between the two genres, whereby opera always precedes cinema, or worse, somehow becomes it. Instead, it would behoove us to consider the ways in which both genres drew on a common cultural archive, a repository of discursive threads which might include theories of artistic union influenced by reception of the Gesamtkunstwerk, debates about the future of Italian music, drawing on concerns about opera's viability, and self-conscious diagnoses of modernity or a lack thereof, shaped by uniquely Italian insecurities about cultural and technological progress. Cinema during the silent era was a composite experience, comprising film, music, and sometimes other elements, poetry, sound effects, a singer, that came together as an audiovisual unity only during projections. We cannot easily recreate the conditions that created this composite, for it inheres in those isolated fragments that survive. A film here, some sheet music there, reviews, posters, and so on. But fragmentation and isolation should not restrict us to comment only on those concrete ways that early film music draws on musical precedent. For the networks that these resonant fragments together create can get us to the very heart of the aesthetic differences between early cinema and its multimedia relatives. And I would argue that it is only by reading creatively into such networks that we can define something called film music, at the moment, notionally, of its birth. Thank you very much.